Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. I'm Diane Okonski, President of the Icelandic National League of the United States, and I'm so happy that you're joining in with us tonight. Before we get started with the program, I have a couple of reminders for you. The first is that you are on mute, but we do want to get your questions answered, and so to submit them, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you are on a smartphone or a tablet, that button may be in the upper right-hand corner, or you may have to swipe to find it, but don't let that stop you. We will get to as many questions as we can during the course of the program. Secondly, the program is being recorded and will be available on the INLUS website, that's inlus.org website in just a few days and available for viewing at that time. Tonight we have with us Stefan Jonasson, the editor of the Lögberg-Heimskringla newspaper. A graduate of the University of Winnipeg, Stefan holds degrees in arts and theology and is a journalist, historian, folklorist, and a Unitarian minister. In addition to all of that, he is currently the chair of the University of Manitoba's Board of Regents and the president of the Icelandic National League of North America, the INLUS's sister organization in Canada. He has received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2013, and he was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Icelandic Order of the Falcon in 2019. Among his many other honors are the Betty Gorsh Heritage Award for contributions to preserving, understanding, and celebrating Unitarian Universalist history, and the Joan Inge Ailson Kadam Award for promotion of Icelandic culture and heritage through literature, arts, and media. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I am on the board of the Lögberg-Heimskringla. But Stefan, thank you for taking time out of your really busy schedule to join us this evening and talk about the paper. So I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diane. I'm actually thrilled to be here tonight to talk about Lögberg-Heimskringla, which has always interested me, but has been my favorite topic for the last 7 years since I became editor of the publication. It is one of the gems, I think, of the Icelandic community here in North America. And I never tire of talking about it these days, partly because I live and breathe it 7 days a week, it seems. I'm working harder now than I ever did, even though I'm a part-time editor. But I just love to immerse myself in Icelandic culture and heritage and the news of Iceland and news of Icelandic events and our great history. So this is a real opportunity. I once said to my wife that that my dream job in retirement would be to edit Lögberg-Heimskringla, and it never occurred to me that it would happen. And of course, it didn't occur to me that it would happen 10 years earlier than I had initially planned to retire. So let me take you on a journey through history, through one of the great treasures of our Icelandic heritage. And so let this be a lesson to everyone that you should prepare in advance and make sure that you're actually the master of your own technology. I'm not. So let me tell you the story of Lögberg-Heimskringla, and we will do this without the beautiful illustrations that I had arranged, all 25 of them. Lögberg-Heimskringla, as it turns out, is actually the oldest continuously published ethnic newspaper in Canada. And it is one of the very oldest in the United States. I think we're second or third in the list of US ethnic publications. And it's really a remarkable achievement. We've been in business since our beginning for 135 years. And at a time when even some of the finest daily newspapers across America are closing their doors. It's a real accomplishment that we're actually still in business and publishing. If most print newspapers have declining subscription rates and a declining pool of subscribers, being an ethnic biweekly publication, we have everything they have with a much larger dose. Because of course, over the course of time and as the generations pass, people drift away from involvement in their ethnic communities. And with each passing generation, the number of people who still have an interest in the homeland, if you will, or the old country, declines. Even though the number of people who might be able to pass an ancestry DNA test continues to increase. And that's the situation we're in. But after 135 years, we continue to publish. I think we have as good a publication today as we have had at any point in the history of Lögberg-Heimskringla. And we continue to present the news from Iceland, news from North America, and we continue to be immersed in the Icelandic culture. Of course, our mission has changed. When our paper was first founded, or its predecessor papers were founded, it was the purpose of Heimskringla and Lögberg, of course, to present the essential weekly news to Icelandic readers in Canada and the United States, because they needed it presented in the Icelandic language. So much of the content in those early years was actually news from Canada and the United States that Icelandic community members needed to know, but it was presented in a language that was familiar to them. If that was the mission of Lögberg-Heimskringla then, the mission of Lögberg-Heimskringla today is actually to present Iceland from a North American point of view. I don't need to tell you that there are other publications and websites that you can look at to get the news about Iceland in English. But we are distinctive in that we present Iceland, all things Icelandic, and the Icelandic communities in North America from a North American perspective. And that makes us distinctive, if not necessarily unique. It is a mission that kind of came to dominate about half a century ago, but it has allowed us to remain relevant in the modern world. And so I like to think that Lögberg-Heimskringla is the newspaper of record for the Icelandic community in North America. Much like the New York Times or the Toronto Globe and Mail, and that our pages are where you look to find a record of the most important events that have taken place in the Icelandic communities here, and as importantly, to get a sense of what's happening in Iceland, but with a North American perspective about what's important. And so let me take you back to the very beginnings of the paper. Actually, let me take you back even before the very beginnings of Lögberg-Heimskringla, because the Icelanders, when they arrived here in Manitoba, which is where Lögberg-Heimskringla is headquartered, when they first arrived in Manitoba and made their way to the colony known as New Iceland, the first thing they decided to do was have an argument among themselves about religion. The next thing they decided to do was produce a handwritten newsletter to inform members of the colony about what was happening. And in time, that gave birth to a publication called Framfari, or Progress, which was the first printed Icelandic newspaper in North America. And it continued for a time, and it was followed by a newspaper called Lever, which published for 3 years out of Winnipeg. It was on the shoulders of those two publications that the newspaper Heimskringla emerged on October 7th, 1886. It began publishing under the editorship of Freeman B. Anderson, who was a remarkable figure in many ways. He was born and grew up in the Akureyri area of Iceland, and he came west before the larger immigrations of Icelanders even began. And he settled briefly in Toronto, where he attended school and worked. And then he came west to Winnipeg, where he enrolled as a student at Manitoba College and became the first Icelander to graduate from a university or college on this side of the Atlantic. He proceeded to teach a bit and give public lectures, and then decided to launch the newspaper Heimskringla, which he did in 1886. He wasn't the editor for very long before he headed south to Chicago and then on to Boston, where he worked in the laboratories at MIT. And then he headed back to Iceland, where he became noteworthy for being the greatest of all advocates for the adoption of hydroelectric power. So he has a remarkable career, even if he weren't the first editor of Heimskringla, but he was. He launched the paper and he struggled to keep it afloat. It didn't have a well thought out business plan at the beginning. But he managed to keep it afloat. And while Heimskringla did shutter its doors a couple of times in the early years, it more or less continued publication from then until the merger with the newspaper Lögberg to form Lögberg-Heimskringla. And so it was a modest success, but it struggled. That didn't stop another group of Icelanders who found the pages of Heimskringla at least mildly objectionable. It didn't stop them from launching another newspaper, Lögberg, less than 2 years later. And so on January 14th, 1888, under the editorship of Einar Hjörleifsson, better known as Einar Hjörleifsson Karen, it launched in direct competition with Heimskringla. Einar Karen was himself a brilliant writer, an essayist, a storyteller, a poet, who became very well known back home in Iceland for his writing and for being one of the founders of the Psychic Research Society. He was a brilliant figure and served as the editor of Lögberg for several years, which gave that newspaper a stability that Heimskringla lacked in its early years. At the time, though, people were critical of launching a second Icelandic newspaper when the one they had was already struggling. And Einar Kvaran said, "Some fear that two Icelandic weeklies will come to the same end as the famous Kilkenny cats. That is, eat each other up." That was the fear, but he actually had confidence that that wouldn't be the reality. And it wasn't, at least not for a few generations. Although that continues to be the signature line of my own emails from Lögberg-Heimskringla, I find it such a charming thought. Both newspapers were 4-page weeklies until 1890, when Lögberg went out on a limb and expanded to 8 pages. There was fierce price competition before the two papers until things settled down. And for what it's worth, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the subscription rate in those days. Now, this may seem self-serving because you may think that I'm arguing that subscribing to Lögberg-Heimskringla today is a bargain. But I'm here to tell you that actually you could become a member of Icelandic Roots, a subscriber to Lögberg-Heimskringla, and a member of either the Icelandic National League of the United States or the Icelandic National League of North America, depending on your preference. You could belong to all three of those things and pay less in today's dollars than it would have cost you to subscribe to either Heimskringla or Lögberg in the early years. When we account for inflation, the subscription cost to either paper compared to the average worker's wage, to their means, would today be in excess of $250 a year. Now, as I say, you may think that I'm making a pitch for you to join all of those organizations or subscribe to Lögberg-Heimskringla today, and well, that would be true. But my bigger point here is I think it points to the devotion, to the commitment of the Icelandic people at that time. In fact, I think it points to their sense of the importance of supporting their own news media here in North America and ensuring that they were successful. In time, by the turn of the century, Lögberg had over 1,500 subscribers paying these royal rates for the privilege, and Heimskringla had about 1,000. Some people, subscribed to both publications, but there was a tendency in the Icelandic community for one neighbor to subscribe to one and another neighbor to subscribe to the other. And when they were done reading their copy of either Heimskringla or Lögberg, they would pass it on to their neighbors to read the other publication. That way, people were enormously well informed, and both newspapers were pretty well supported in those days. They entered this enterprise without a very strong business plan, but it turned out that the business looked after itself for them, and the two papers thrived in those days. They competed fiercely. They reflected very different points of view, sometimes quite controversial, but they thrived. Heimskringla tended to support the Conservative Party in Canadian politics, and yet it was liberal in religion, supporting the Unitarian movement and later what was called the New Theology, a religious movement that found itself partway between the Unitarians and the Lutherans. In the United States, Heimskringla tended to favor the Democratic Party in politics, notwithstanding their conservative commitment in Canada. And back home in Iceland, they tended to favor the policy of the Home Rule Party. Lögberg, by contrast, favored the Liberal Party in Canada. It staunchly supported the Icelandic Evangelical Lutheran Synod. And in the United States, it supported the Republicans over the Democrats, while back in Iceland, they supported the old Independence Party. That is to say, those members of the Icelandic Althing who were in the greatest hurry to achieve independence for the homeland. It was an interesting and complicated set of alliances that these two papers developed. And it's important, I suppose, to remember that in those days, it might be argued that the Conservative Party was the more economically interventionist of the two parties in Canada, while the Liberals tended towards free trade and open markets. And in the United States, the Republican Party in those days was full of people that today we'd call liberals, while the Democratic Party had many people that today we would identify as conservatives. It was a different time, but it's still curious that the two papers found themselves advocating from a different part of the spectrum when it came to religion and to politics. And I sometimes explain this by noting that it was sort of a first come, first claimed situation. That the first newspaper to stake out a particular territory got to keep it. And the next newspaper, if it wanted to generate controversy in the community, that is to say, generate ratings for itself and sell newspapers, it simply took a contrary point of view. And such was the life of these two newspapers in the early years. They fought. They fought royally, as we might say. They fought vociferously over a variety of issues, and sometimes they came together. For instance, when the Icelandic Festival of Manitoba was founded, the two newspapers were actually on the same wavelength in promoting it. Sure, it had taken 15 years for anyone to get around to the idea of having an Icelandic festival in Manitoba, but once one of the newspapers came out in favor of it, the second newspaper rallied to its support. Things began to change a bit during the early years of the 20th century. The two papers still favored one party over the other and one church over another. But under the editorship of Baldvin Baldvinsson, Heimskringla started to moderate its position and covered the news more equitably, if you will, in a more balanced fashion, and Lögberg largely followed suit. And so the opinion pieces in the papers still tended to track in one direction or the other, depending on the newspaper, but the news coverage became more reliable. And people were more likely to cross paths and subscribe to a different paper than they might be the usual suspects for. And so the papers really began to grow together nearly 60 years before they merged. And so they had to find other ways to set themselves apart from one another. Although I would have been on the Heimskringla side of the newspaper wars of those days, I have to admit that Lögberg was the physically more attractive newspaper. They had more pictures. They had a better graphic presentation. Heimskringla continued to look like an old 19th century newspaper for many years, but Lögberg started to adopt the techniques of the mainstream North American media and became more elegant, more visually beautiful as a newspaper. I should point out that during this period in the first decade of the 20th century, there was also briefly an Icelandic newspaper in the United States called Vinland, which was published out of Minnesota, Minnesota for 6 or 8 years, I believe. And it was an important paper and in many ways paralleled both Heimskringla and Lögberg with a more distinctively American focus. But it never caught on the way that Heimskringla and Lögberg did. I think the reality here is that if we look at the history of the Scandinavian press in North America, Winnipeg became what Chicago was for the Swedish American press and what Minneapolis was for the Norwegian American press. It became the publication center, partly because it was a population center. The borders were also more permeable in those days. And so students from North Dakota would come north to Winnipeg to study arts or the law or medicine. And Icelandic Canadians would head south from Manitoba to Grand Forks to study arts and law and medicine at the University of North Dakota. There was a lot of movement back and forth during the first half century of the Icelandic presence in the upper Midwest. And so it, if you will, the community was more comfortable with the Icelandic newspapers being published out of Winnipeg, while the Norwegian papers came out of Minneapolis and Iowa, and the Swedish newspapers tended to come out of Chicago. So there was this movement back and forth, and And of course, editors moved back and forth too, and contributors to the two newspapers. This carried on for some time. The First World War led to a disruption. I think that one of the ways that we can account for Icelandic Americans enrolling in the Canadian military during the First World War was that they were reading Heimskringla and Lögberg. And as a consequence, Icelandic Americans tended to be involved in the conflict in Europe before the rest of Americans were, since the United States didn't enter the war until 1917. But there was conflict here. Sigurður Julius Jonasson, who was the editor of Lögberg during the early years of the First World War, and who was to the left of its readership, was a pacifist by nature and ended up being fired by Lögberg. And so yet another Icelandic weekly, Veröld, the Age of Spring, began to be published in Winnipeg. It tended to support the newly emerging Independent Labour Party in Canada, supported the strikers during the Winnipeg General Strike, and adopted a more pacifist position with regards to the war. As a consequence, Stefan Stefansson was a popular contributor to that newspaper. However, it entered the fray without a business plan, just as its two predecessors did, but it wasn't as successful at continuing to publish. And so it was the case that after 3 years or so, that newspaper went out of business, leaving just Heimskringla and Lögberg still standing. In 1919, the Icelandic National League was organized in Winnipeg in the aftermath of Iceland achieving its sovereignty as a nation. We sometimes like to talk about 1944 as the year of Iceland's sovereignty, but in point of fact, it became a fully independent nation in 1918. It shared a king with Denmark, but otherwise the government was entirely independent of the Danish government. Its foreign affairs were handled by the Danish Foreign Ministry, but only at the Icelandic government's direction. And it was in the aftermath of that that the Icelandic National League was organized, and the newspapers once again began to shift their emphasis. In fact, I would say that it's in this period that the Icelandic North American weeklies became more distinctly North American as newspapers, but not before they had influenced a new newspaper that began to be published in Iceland towards the end of the first decade of the 20th century, and that was Morgunblaðið. If you look at the early issues of Morgunblaðið, it is difficult to escape the idea that, in fact, its editors drew upon Lögberg for their inspiration for how they would produce a paper. Because in point of fact, in 1919, 1920, and even before, in the years when Morgunblaðið began publishing, the Icelandic press in North America was arguably in advance of the Icelandic newspapers back in Iceland. That's not a criticism, just simply an observation. And any of you who have spent a lot of time wandering around the Tímarit site, looking at old Icelandic newspapers, will have some sense of what I mean about the length and depth of articles that appeared in the Icelandic North American weeklies, and about the graphic qualities of the newspapers that were produced. They were simply better newspapers. And they influenced the newspapers back in Iceland. This is not a surprise, because up until 1920, there were as many Icelandic books being published in Winnipeg as there were in Copenhagen or in Reykjavik. And the press here was a significant publisher of serial running novels, of news content, of feature stories, of poetry, of historical pieces. They were leaders in the field, and they influenced the press back home. This can be explained largely by the fact that in Winnipeg's West End, during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there were nearly as many Icelanders living within a few miles of one another as there were in the city of Reykjavik at the time. And so that was the state of the press until 1920. Over the ensuing years, the newspapers began to struggle. By then, 2 generations in North America had passed, and there was a greater hunger to read English language newspapers on the part of members of the Icelandic community. There was less of a need for members of the Icelandic community to have the news conveyed to them in the Icelandic language. They could pick up the Manitoba Free Press or the Grand Forks Herald and read the news for themselves. They didn't need the support of the Icelandic weeklies the same. And so the papers became more focused on reporting about the Icelandic community here. I love reading the social notes from those periods. If you want to know what your ancestors were doing, if you read the pages of Heimskringla and Lögberg and look for the social notes that appear, you can see when they visited the West Coast because it was cold here on the prairies, or when they returned from the West Coast to visit with family members who had stayed behind here. You can see their comings and their goings. You can read charming articles about their thoughts and their feelings. One of the most delightful pieces I read was a letter from my own great-grandfather, who was remembered by some of the women in my family as being a bit sexist, but who in fact wrote to the newspaper to suggest that the world would be a much better place if it were governed by women. And so it was that he was advocating for women to be enfranchised and to participate fully in the government in the United States and Canada. What a delightful surprise that was to me. And it made me think that at least one of my great aunts may have had issues with her father that weren't directly related to matters of gender, but perhaps different worldviews in other areas. In any event, it's a treasure house to read through these old newspapers and see stories by everyday people. In fact, one of the great things about the Icelandic press, both in Iceland and here in North America, is that our newspapers in both lands covered the stories of everyday people that our neighbors of other ethnic heritages can only dream of. Everyone was important in the Icelandic community. Everyone had a voice and a say. Everyone had an opinion worthy of respect, and everyone was worthy to contribute to the newspapers, their stories, their articles, their opinion pieces, their memoirs. And so the publications told the story of our community here in North America with a depth and a breadth that no other ethnic community enjoys. Now, that may not have sounded like a pitch, but it could be, because that's still our mission as a newspaper, to tell the story of everyday Icelandic North Americans, to report on the things that they consider important, to report on the activities that are happening in their local Icelandic clubs, to share their opinions on Icelandic or North American cinema, to share their opinions on all manner of cultural things, to publish their stories and accounts of what they understand being Icelandic to mean. And so I suppose this is a pitch to reclaim that heritage that dominated through the middle of the 20th century and use Lögberg-Heimskringla as a vehicle to share your stories with others. It is, in fact, easier for an Icelandic North American to get published than just about anyone else. And it's not for lack of quality. And it's not because Lögberg-Heimskringla doesn't have standards. It's simply that we give a voice to the members of the Icelandic community. And we have been the first route of publication for many individuals who have gone on to great careers as authors. I'm thinking of the legendary Bill Holm from Minnesota, or W.D. Valgerdson from out in Victoria. I'm thinking of Betty Jane Wiley and Laura Goodman Salverson, the award-winning novelist. All of these individuals from our Icelandic community were able to get themselves published in the pages of Heimskringla or Lögberg, or since 1959, Lögberg-Heimskringla. And from there, they drew the attention of the mainstream publishers and all went on to brilliant writing careers. Now, of course, it wasn't just Lögberg-Heimskringla that helped them in this regard. They are all truly great authors. But Lögberg-Heimskringla was where they first found someone willing to read their writing, take it seriously, and put it out in print. Well, the newspapers struggled through the years of the Great Depression, and by the 1940s, during the Second World War, as publications began to come out more in the English language, people began to wonder if Heimskringla or Lögberg could survive. In fact, it was in the 1930s, during the difficult years of the Great Depression, that the first predictions that they wouldn't began to be made. That accelerated in the 1950s and then, or in 1940s, and then in the 1950s, there are a number of private letters that you can find in archives everywhere, predicting the imminent demise of the two newspapers. Subscription numbers were declining. Advertising was declining. People increasingly were shifting their reading preferences to English, or if they did read Icelandic, began subscribing to newspapers and magazines coming from the homeland itself. But a group of people got together and determined to merge the three newspapers. They tried 3 times. It's almost folkloric, the merger of Heimskringla and Lögberg. They tried 3 times to merge the newspapers, and they were unsuccessful the first 2 efforts. But the third time, well, the porridge was just right. And they managed to pull off a merger. And in 1959, the 2 newspapers came together and they published the first issue of Lögberg-Heimskringla. It was an amazing accomplishment. And they continued to transform their mission, albeit slowly, to adapt to changing circumstances. And while the paper was still primarily in Icelandic in those days, there was an intimation all the way back to the second year of Heimskringla's publication that the newspapers would eventually change. The first issue of Heimskringla's second year was called the Polyglot Issue. It was published in 6 different languages. They actually published the same content in 6 different languages to emphasize the importance of being fluent in more than one language, and to emphasize that the Icelandic community would one day find themselves speaking one or more of these other languages here in North America. Well, it took what, 80 years, 90 years or more before we got there. But beginning in the 1950s, we started to see an increase in the number of English language articles that appeared. And then the paper became predominantly English in 1980. And the first all English issue appeared 20 years later, in August of 2000. We have published principally in English ever since. And of course, it's a constant source of confusion and dismay to us when we try to hand someone a copy of Lögberg-Heimskringla and they look at the masthead and they say, "I'm sorry, I don't speak Icelandic." And we have to say, well, neither does the editor. And if you look below the masthead, you'll see that everything is now available, or nearly everything, in the English language. But we maintain these historic names, Lögberg and Heimskringla, because we cherish everything they represent. If it helps you, think of Lögberg as being the Icelandic equivalent of the Tribune, and think of Heimskringla as being the equivalent of the Globe. And if you can get beyond that and then look down into the pages of Lögberg-Heimskringla, what you will discover is a newspaper that truly presents Iceland from a North American perspective, that tells the stories of Icelandic North Americans in their own words, that shares our poetry and promotes our musicians, that celebrates Icelandic culture and highlights important anniversaries in our history and important events that are happening all across North America, whether it's exhibitions at the Nordic Museum in Seattle, the Deuce of August every August, as you would expect, in Mountain, North Dakota, events down at the Icelandic Association of Washington, D.C., the Viking Festival, the Nordic Bridges events currently going on in Toronto, Ontario. We cover all of these cultural events. It's been tough during COVID because less is happening in person and people are submitting fewer stories because there are fewer things happening that people gather for. And yet we continue to cover things like, well, Icelandic National League of the United States webinars, which have had fascinating interviews with the Icelandic ambassador to the United States, or stories about events that continue to happen in the Icelandic American community. We publish everything that seems newsworthy and a little bit more. And we always welcome contributions from those who think they may have a gift for writing. And I would add, we welcome contributions from those who were convinced by their grade school teachers that they couldn't write at all. You see, that's actually the job of an editor, to take whatever raw material is submitted from people with great ideas or important stories to tell, and to polish them for publication. And so we proudly publish the whole range of things in Lögberg-Heimskringla. And we like to think that there is nowhere else that Icelandic North Americans can go to see their stories continue to be told in compelling and understanding ways than in the pages of Lögberg-Heimskringla. We endeavor to support the various Icelandic organizations in North America by paying attention to their activities. And of course, we hope to always attract a wide number of subscribers across North America who are interested in reading about everything Icelandic that you could imagine wanting to read about. Every year we have a special travel issue. Sometimes the editor makes predictions about how soon travel is going to reopen that he later regrets. But we promote Icelandic travel. We promote travel to the Icelandic communities here in North America. We love to tell the story of the Icelandic communities in North Dakota and Minnesota, to talk about Washington Island and Seattle and Blaine. We love to talk about the pockets where Icelanders have settled since the Second World War, places that are sometimes invisible to us, in Los Angeles and Washington and New York and Miami, places where Icelandic Americans today live and thrive. We talk about Icelandic culture and celebrate when an Icelander wins an Academy Award, something we can now say has actually happened. And we love to tell the story of when either an Icelandic North American or one of our friends over in Iceland publishes a new book that captures the world's imagination, such as the new book Secrets of the Sprakkar, which was published in America today by the First Lady of Iceland, Eliza Reid. We share all of this news and commentary, and we do so proudly. It is a privilege and nothing short of a miracle that after 135 years, Lögberg-Heimskringla continues to publish. There is no end in sight. And so we invite your contributions, we invite your submissions, we invite your subscriptions. And well, I think it's time to invite your questions.
Oh, thank you, Stefan. I can't imagine how many stories have been written in 135 years. But if someone does have a story or wants to tell the history of a location or a book review or whatever they fancy would be of interest to others, how do they actually submit it to the LH?
The best thing is to submit it to me directly. But I suppose I should tell you about our website. We are also online. Everyone is multimedia these days. Now, you know, we have an exclusive or a near exclusive on publication. There's also the Icelandic Connection, and of course there's many good Icelandic organizations newsletters. But we're the only biweekly that publishes. But online, we like to go online to actually compete with INLUS and compete with Icelandic Roots and the INLNA and other organizations on social media and with our web presence. You can find our website at LH-CA. Let me think here. Yes,
It's
LH-INC. Thank you, Diane. LH-INC.ca. It would have been better to start with my email address because that I can remember. It's simply Stefan at LH-Inc.ca. And so the web address is embedded in my email address. Contributions can be sent there. If you can spell it, of course, you can just Google Lögberg-Heimskringla and find your way to the site. Although you may on the way pass by some stories about Norwegian kings from over 1,000 years ago, depending on what your browser picks up. But the stories can be submitted there. I love receiving them. I will tell you that I do reject some stories. We try to avoid political and religious controversy, although we do publish political and religious stories. So there's a difference between the two. We try not to poke one another in the eye as a publication and maintain some degree of civility. But we do also allow some measure of controversy. It's okay to have differing opinions and to express those opinions, although the editor may sometimes ask contributors to tone something down or rephrase it. And sometimes people will submit stories that I find myself scratching my head thinking, I don't think our readers are likely to be interested in this. In those cases, though, I make it my mission to help contributors find a different publication. For instance, I've received submissions that I directed towards scholarly magazines because I thought they were worthy of being published in those places. I have even redirected submissions to English language newspapers or magazines where I thought they were a better fit. But mostly we like to publish what we receive, and we certainly encourage people to submit what they have on their mind. Sometimes we invite particular submissions. As Christmas is approaching, we ask for Christmas stories. As our literature and culture issue approaches, I like to ask people what's on their nightstand that they're reading that they might like to offer a few words about. Sometimes I steal people's content from their Facebook posts and write to them and tell them that their Facebook posts are so compelling that if they would allow us to, we would like to publish a version of it in the newspaper. So any of those ways will get our attention. You can also, of course, go to our Facebook page and submit stories through there, and so we will receive them in pretty much any form you want to send them in.
All right. Well, we also have not so much a comment, but a thank you. This is from Susan Atwood, and she said she just thanks you so much for the presentation, that I love my subscription to the Lögberg-Heimskringla, and my parents and grandparents always subscribed. It's an awesome publication, and you're a great editor for the paper. So thank you so much, Stefan, for taking
I think I may be blushing. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time. So Stefan, we're going to have to put my questions on the back burner for another time. We also have a comment from Jody Armin Jones saying that I've enjoyed scouring past issues of LH, usually via Timurit, to discover insights into my immigrating ancestors in North Dakota. It's very exciting to see an ad for a family business back in the 1920s and 30s in the papers, and have gained insights into their lives and their strong, lifelong homesickness for their homeland. So yes, it's a jewel.
It is grand. And in fact, if people want to get a sense of what Lögberg-Heimskringla is like, we keep the last 5 years of issues behind a paywall because we have to stay in business. And we need people's support, although the subscription rate is a lot less than $250 a year.
Yes, it is.
But we keep it behind a paywall. But before that, so right up into the early years of my editorship, you can read Lögberg-Heimskringla at the Timurit website. And it is wonderful to see. It gives you a flavor of what you do. And I like to think that not only discovering what our ancestors were up to in bygone days, but seeing the more recent issues should be a great motivator for people to want to be involved in the current publication.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again, Stefan, for taking the time and talking with us. This is really been interesting, and it's fun to hear the history of how the paper has come together. But before we wrap up for this evening, I just want to talk to you about a couple of things that are going on within the INLUS over the next few weeks. We have our next webinar scheduled for Monday, February 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern, so a daytime webinar. And we will have Iris Askersdottir Vale demonstrating how to make Icelandic Easter eggs. And that webinar will be facilitated by Veronica Kolumchuk. The one thing that you can say about making your own Easter eggs is they are absolutely guaranteed to be at your house on Easter and in one piece, unless you drop them personally. We're also going to have a webinar on Monday, March 14th at 8 p.m. Eastern. Please join us for an author's corner with author and photographer David Fries, whose latest book is called Iceland Wintertide. And it's a lovely book, beautiful, beautiful photography of Iceland in the winter. And Gay Strandemo will be conducting that interview. And finally, the INLUS will be starting our spring Icelandic language classes just in a couple of weeks. And these will include our normal basic Icelandic class and a conversational Icelandic class. This spring, we are also adding a basic level 2 class that just kind of goes a little bit deeper into some of the nuances of the language. If you would like to participate in any of those, please drop an email to our general mailbox. That's info@inlus.org, and we'll get back with you on instructions. The INLUS is committed to providing these types of programs and languages and other offerings in order to be a connection point for the Icelandic community. Whether you're an Icelander, you're someone of Icelandic descent, or you're someone who's interested in Iceland, we want to be that point of connection. You can learn more about the INLUS via our website, our blogs, our newsletter, our social media sites. A whole variety of options are available to you. And if you aren't a member, we encourage you to join. Your subscription dues help promote scholarships and grants and also local projects. So your money is really worthwhile and well spent. So Stefan, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. And I stumbled because another question just popped up. How would I find out if my great uncle had anything published by LH?
The very simplest way, and I hate to give away a secret here because I sometimes get requests and then I can put on my Wizard of Oz hat and pretend as if I'm a brilliant researcher. The simplest thing is to go to timurit.is, which is TIMARIT.is. And you can then type in your ancestor's name. I would recommend doing it in quotation marks, and also remember that the internet is unforgiving about spelling and about Icelandic characters. So if there's Icelandic characters, use them. Type that in between quotation marks, And then just below the search line, you can choose the newspaper, Lögberg-Heimskringla or Lögberg-Heimskringla. They're archived in 3 different places, and search from there. And the odds are very good that you'll turn up something either by him or about him.
All right, thank you so much. And Stefan, it's been great. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And we'll talk to you soon. Hopefully everybody will come back on the 28th and learn how to make Icelandic Easter eggs. So good night, everyone.